Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy podcast. This is episode 205, Teaching Our Choirs to Listen with James Jordan. If you don't learn what listening is, your choirs will never sing in tune. James Jordan is one of the most prolific choral conductors in the modern era, not just in terms of performance and recordings, but also in scholarship and pedagogy. This episode I'm really excited to bring to you is the first of what will surely be a promising partnership between Choralosophy and GIA Walton. Regular listeners will know that Oxford University Press and I have a similar relationship where they might have access to some really great people doing choral work and publishing choral work that I might not necessarily know. And we are going to work together to promote these episodes in the future, so I am pumped about that. I recently had the privilege of attending 2 sessions given by Professor Jordan at my home convention in Missouri. I was coming out of my chair with excitement, anticipating this conversation that you're about to hear. The presentations were about choral intonation in our rehearsals and the often forgotten relationship between intonation and vocal pedagogy. The ideas presented were exciting, revolutionary, and even outside of the box. In this conversation, we discussed the often missed elements that impact a choir's ability to sing in tune: tongue position, vocal registration, the conductor's breath, music learning theory, and yes, even rhythm. We also discussed the importance of harmonic context and the ability for the singer to be flexible and tune as they go. When there is a problem with a note, don't just teach the note. Fix the notes around the note, Professor Jordan will say later in this episode. Tune in and have your thinking stimulated and challenged, and then, of course, weigh in yourself over on Facebook in the Choralosophers group, or by joining the new Choralosophy community blog space at choralosophy.substack.com. Attention event organizers. Ludus is here to take your events to the next level. Imagine a ticketing platform that's not just about tickets. Ludus offers marketing, fundraising, and even volunteer management, all in one place. It's time to streamline your event management process and impress your attendees. Join the Ludus family today and unlock endless possibilities for your events. Go to ludus.com/Choralosophy and try it out now, free to you. And if you use that link, you'll get the marketing feature free to your customers as well. We all love to travel with our students, but we definitely don't love planning a trip. I know I've been there as the point person for details, and it is a nightmare. Forms, payments, fundraising, it's a never-ending task that takes away from doing what we love. That's where Kaleidoscope Adventures comes in. They've been planning performance trips for more than 30 years and handle all the details from start to finish. And one of the best parts about Kaleidoscope, they have crowdfunding options for every traveler. Contact Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com to find out how they can take your travel beyond expectations. Quick shout out to everyone on the Patreon at the producer level or higher: Brian Long, Venture Studios, Jonah Clicksbull, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, Stephen Kathy Kakachik. Okay, everybody, I am here with the James Jordan. We are going to be talking about concepts related to kind of the missing links in music educators' toolbox for teaching choirs to sing in tune. What are they being taught to listen to? How are they being taught to listen? In what ways can solfège play into that equation? Audiation, a variety of different topics. I've been excited to have this conversation for quite a while. So, Professor Jordan, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks for asking me. And it's great to have this chat because it's material I hope everybody will pay attention to. It's the product, Chris, of literally 40 years of teaching. From my start with Ed Gordon, and I've been mulling with his ideas all these years, taking a step at a time, validating each step, and then moving to the next one. So I think I've finally arrived at a place I'm really comfortable with telling people that this is something people should pay attention to. So there you have it.
Yeah. No, I'm excited to dig into those things. Before we get there, though, just in case somebody in my audience doesn't know too much about you, I think most choir directors probably do, but why don't you just give us the brief biographical? What do you do on a day-to-day basis? Kind of how do you conceive of your job? How would you explain it to me if I was a stranger at the airport bar and I said, hey, what do you do?
Well, I'm Director of Choral Studies at Westminster Choir College. I can't believe I'm saying this, I'm the 7th conductor of the Westminster Choir in its 100-year history. Westminster is one of the most unique places on the planet where everybody comes there to sing.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, the the community is very different than most places. They're all singers and they're all moving toward the same goal. I'm in charge of the largest graduate program in the United States. We have 15 people in the program on ground. Plus, we have another program, a choral pedagogy program, which is kind of a hybrid of choral pedagogy and vocal ped, which is totally online. And we have 20 students enrolled in that program. In fact, I just got a questionnaire about it this morning from a prospective student in Kentucky. But my day to day is rehearsals and conducting classes. That's it. In the summer, I have workshops. I have two on campus. I have one at Villanova, and then soon to be announced, I'm going to starting some workshops around the country on a website called thechoralacademy.com. And I
Okay.
encourage all listeners to put their name on the mailing list so that you find out what I'm doing. But that's basically it. Recordings. Just released the 18th recording that I've done with the West. This one's with the Westminster Choir, and I'm very proud of it. So one
That's
thing I
awesome.
would say, Chris, before we start talking is that one of the things there are a lot of I suppose there are a lot of people who talk about choral sound, but as they say in the legal world, you ain't got the receipts. I would encourage people to listen to the latest Westminster Choir recording called "The Serenity of Soul," and that sound is a product of what we're going to be talking about, solely a product of what we're talking about. So you can hear the results of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited to hear that. And since you mention a sound that is the product of what we're about to talk about, that phrase that you just used, that resonates with me very strongly because I've been kind of thinking about some of the same things I heard you talk about at a presentation in Missouri recently about this concept of intonational solfège. And of course, I come at it from the perspective of teaching high school, where I'm teaching quite regularly kids who have never seen a piece of sheet music before. They've never played in a band, never played piano, and how do I get them to be able to hear music in their head at a detailed level, kind of like Edwin Gordon talks about. And so when you were giving that presentation, I just started, like, my mind was spinning. So why don't you start off by kind of making the case, so to speak, for what it is that you're trying to communicate with this concept of intonational solfège, kind of the elevator pitch maybe for this idea. How would you describe it?
Okay, so I think if before we get to solfège and the role that plays and the role how we get people to sing in tune, I think the thing that's most important to understand that I think is I hate to use this word, but revolutionary is that I starting in the pandemic when I had to literally teach a choir online. I asked some of my voice science colleagues, can you create a choral sound online? And they said yes, which kind of shocked me. But what I learned, Chris, while I wouldn't want to live through the pandemic again, what I learned through that process has changed everything I've done. And basically, it's this. So if you're worried about intonation and you're worried about blend, then you better be worried about tongue position. All choral sound. The problem that we have, whether I don't care the level you're at, we're dealing with English speakers. And the problem with English speakers is that the tongue position tends to ride low in the mouth, and the tongue gets very thick in the back, and the vowels are placed very, very far back. So, in past years, you and I have probably gone to workshops where they've given us all these tricks about saying that the sound is forward and giving us all these, do this with your lips, do this with the vowel, do that. Well, all of that creates more problems than it actually fixes because it's a choral band-aid. It
Yep.
fixes the problem for the minute, but it doesn't fix it long range. And the big thing that was going around for years, and as a clarinetist, this was bizarre to me because I didn't understand it, but everybody would talk about, well, in choirs, you can't deal with registration. Voice teachers would tell me, you can't deal with registration. It's too complex. Well, it is complex, but it's complex because we don't get the language straightened out, which causes the register problem. So the issue is what I now do religiously is my choir only vocalizes initially in the front side of the warm-up on a German umlaut E sound, so that the tongue is high, E, and if this is tongue and this is teeth, the tongue is against the lower teeth, and the top of the tongue is against the rails, the tooth rails in the back. Now that feels bizarre, and it feels like you have a mouthful of tongue, but that's what you need to feel, because when that happens, the whole pharyngeal passage opens and you get a healthy resonance. It's just that your mouth does not feel like it does when it speaks, and that's the goal.
Uh-huh.
So
Yep.
here's the deal. The deal is, I sound like Joe Biden. The deal is that if think of this. First of all, that German umlaut E, and by the way, on there's a website on the landing page of the GIA music.com website that says virtual classroom. On that website are incredible things, self-help things for teachers. One of them is a video on how to teach the mixed vowel. There's also 6 hours of how to conduct a warm-up. There's no course that teaches people how to set the sound in a warm-up. Well, 2 years ago, I spent 6 hours coaching students on gestures I've learned all the way back from Frauke Hasemann to seed a sound and to kind of nurture a sound. But that being said, that mixed vowel, Chris, you imagine this. Register problems are gone. I read every piece, not on nu, not on ni, as I've written about, but on ni. The other problem, the misnomer, is if you say sung or sing, if you say sing, that's probably where your back of your tongue should be. And the other issue is that by doing this, if this is this is your tongue, e, I, e, u are all high tongue vowels. U is not a flat tongue vowel. Then we
Right.
have ah, which is obviously different in a different vowel category. But I can tell you, if you do this, your ahs and your uhs, if you ever have them in diction, are incredibly brilliant and balanced because the resonance of the head is brought through. So the use of the mixed vowel gets rid of register problems, and it gets almost rid of blend and intonational problems. Why? Because everybody's producing the sound in the same way.
Yeah.
I it I think of all the years I spent kind of manipulating vowels and using every trick I could find. And you had register problems, you had altos going in the chest, you had and it wasn't healthy. But now all that's gone. And then once that's in place, then the use of your own breath as a conductor can change the resonance of a choir. And on this recording, this Serenity of Soul recording, what I'm proud of, Chris, is there is Bruckner on that recording. There is Brahms on the recording. There is Bruckner. There's the James Erb Shenandoah. They are all different sounds that I did not manipulate. It was all done through me breathing, period. And the choir's breathing.
Yeah.
So the intonational solfège issue, let me say what I hit on. So going back to Ed Gordon, people don't understand. Well, they do understand. I think there's enough people in the country that know about Gordon, but we learn through patterns. And the other thing I forgot that Ed always said, and I never believed him until now, he says you can't develop the ear using scalar passages. Because what happens is a singer will just slide between pitches and not be exact. He said you have to use triadic functions. So all my warm-ups at the beginning are triadic with rich harmonic accompaniments, and that's the trick.
Hmm.
So a number of years ago, I published a book called The Core Vocal Exercises. And I would encourage everyone to use these, because what I did was I used Gordon principles. The choir only vocalizes in tonic and dominant patterns, but underneath there's a harmonic rhythm that teaches them musical line and phrase. And so I'm kind of hiding pattern training, and I'm hiding development of singing in tune with one another, because the big thing that I think Gordon left us, is that we learn to sing by singing in context. Meaning, we have a great tool in choirs. We sing with other people. I have band singing a part alone. That's not done in any of my graduate students' rehearsals or in mine. You either sing with another part, or you sing with the the reduction of the part or the accompaniment. But it has to be in context, because intonation is flexible. I grew up as a clarinetist and I love wind ensemble playing, and I know that my intonation is contextual. I have to tune a G for where it sits in the chord. And I do that by listening. And
Right.
so the whole purpose of intonational solfège is to show people that the way you teach intonation is by always making sure the choir knows where the dominant is, period.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I think I used at the convention, but it works. It's almost like kind of a magic elixir. When you have an intonation problem in a choir, if you're in, now you have to analyze the key you're in at the moment. So if you're in D and the choir is going out of tune, they go out of tune because they lose track of where the dominant is, or they're inexperienced and they don't know that. So what I started using, I won't tell you this long story because it's long, but I use these Malmar choir chimes, these aluminum tubular chimes that are that 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 have only a fundamental. And when you strike that dominant above the chord, the whole chord pulls into tune.
Yeah.
So it becomes an experiential way of learning intonation in context and listening. The other thing I would say, Chris, that I would want people listening to this to understand, if you don't listen and understand what listening is, your choirs will never sing in tune. The what happens, one of the books I want to write is called The Neurology of Conducting. And there's a lot of neurological information that the act of listening creates a neurological thing in the room that they begin to listen. And I also will say that you need to tell your choirs to listen to each other. The
Yes.
first thing that you just got to do that, but understanding that if you're not listening, they're not going to listen. You can preach listening all your life. And if you don't listen in an honest way, and not in a judgmental way, but just listen. I mean, that's the thing that's hardest, because when we're working, we think and we're reacting in a rehearsal, and the minute that listening bond is gone, then you too will have intonation problems in the choir.
Yeah.
But this triadic issue is really important. And when there's a note problem, don't teach the note, teach the pattern that surrounds it, to the note that surrounded that leads into it, because the bad intonation probably started two pitches before the bad pitch appeared.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So all right, so that's a lot of information, and I'm sitting here going, yes, like these are all things that that I believe very strongly in, and I want to go back and just take the listener through some of the concepts one at a time, because when you did that session, you talked, for example, back to the mixed vowel concept.
Right.
I brought that back and did it the next day at in my choir in my choir rehearsal, and let me tell you what happened. So. I had mixed results with it depending on how experienced the singers were. So, for example, in my advanced chamber choir of 11th and 12th graders, these are kids who have already been trained to look at a piece of music and do a pretty good job of hearing what it's supposed to sound like, and most of them take voice lessons. So the idea of where to put my tongue in my mouth was like they understood that terminology, and it worked instantly. It was the most in tune we have ever sung all year long, and they're all looking around at each other like, "What is this that we're doing?" And we do that. But with my beginners, it had mixed success, and what I mean by that is for those kids, they're ninth graders. Some of them have never sung before. They don't know they don't, just the very concept of how to manipulate their tongue inside of their mouth is foreign to them in the first place. And so there was some scaffolding that we had to do to get us to that point. And so I think it's when you say, magic kind of thing, I agree, as long as they know how to do it. So that's one. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think there is a learning curve for singers who have not sung or don't have instruction, because the tongue is an incredibly strong muscle that influences laryngeal position, everything. It's very strong, and the root of the tongue is, if one of the things that I think is important, um, when we were doing this in pandemic, we watched a lot of videos on YouTube called "Singing in the MRI." And what these are singers that are in an MRI machine and are singing, and you can see that tongue.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of the problem is that people don't they think their tongue is what they feel at the tip. The tongue goes all the way back into the root.
Right.
So I think a visual is helpful, and I think you are unlearning speech muscle patterns, because we don't use a German mixed vowel. We don't have a vowel where the tongue sits in that high position and actually occupies two resonant spaces, which is E and U. Ooh. So I think there is a long thing to get them to do it, but I also think it has to do with, do you know, which I'm sure you do, but I would say to every teacher, do you know what a mixed vowel sounds like?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you listen to, because that's when you can tell. You can hear also when it goes toward E with pressure. That's the other problem. When you do this, they won't let the vowel speak. So then they apply pressure. And when they apply pressure, it goes toward a bright E sound. And
Mm-hmm.
then you have to kind of find the trick. So say, think more ooh in the sound, which they don't do. But again, I would agree with you. These things called on YouTube, singing in the MRI. There's a bunch of them just to see the tongue. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree
Yeah.
with yeah, I agree with you.
Another one of the tricks that I took from your presentation and tried it right away was the idea of reinforcing the dominant to get the kids to sing in tune. So I didn't have any Malmark bells in my room. I do plan to get a set for next year. But what I did, in fact, there's a video of me doing this recently on my TikTok channel, where I was kind of running a camera on myself, and we were doing a music dictation portion of our final, where I play patterns and ask them to write them down and tell me what they heard, that kind of thing. And I have them sing the scale of scales and triadic patterns prior to doing the dictation, so that they can have that key kind of locked into their head. And then, but it was 2 days from the end of the school year, and they were kind of lazy and slouched over, and they were starting to sing those patterns out of tune. And I just reached over to the piano and kind of very lightly tickled the dominant in the upper register of the piano, the upper octaves of the piano, and you can hear on the recording they just instantly whoosh, lock right back into tune, rather than what a lot of teachers would do probably is go to the piano notes that they're supposed to be singing and try to pound them real hard, so that they'll match. And I actually find that hinders their ability to sing in tune. It doesn't help.
Because it's not contextual. What you're doing is this comes from two sources. I attribute my finding this. There's a book called Choral Intonation that I wrote in 2000, where I
Okay.
was playing with this.
Mm-hmm.
And what really appeared to me is two things. So one of the things Ed Gordon always talked about is, Ed was fascinated with early childhood, and what he would call childhood musical babble, where they're they sing a minor third all the time. And then all of a sudden, Ed's theory was they're ready to accept musical instruction when they sing lulu lulu. They hover around the dominant. Childhood songs hover around the dominant. And Kodai even said that Somi is the most naturally occurring interval. Well, Ed's theory was it's naturally occurring because they know where do is. Okay, hold that thought. My first job was elementary school, and the school had a huge Orff instrumentarium. And so I went to a workshop to learn about Orff. And one of the things that I carried away from that, the teacher teaching it said, now, if the children are singing out of tune, put more dominant bars in the orchestration, in the instruments. Take away some of the tonic and put more dominant in it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hell, I mean, that's Carl Orff. The thing I would say for singers, they have to hear the dominant above where they're singing. I usually use an alternating octave at the piano, but here's the problem with the piano. Both of those pitches you play in the upper octave alternatively, one will have more overtones than the other, and you pray to God that the octave is in tune.
Right, right. Yeah.
And so that's why the choir chimes are so very important. That once you do that, it locks in. So I understand it takes a while, but again, I would also say you got to continue and reinforce it as you read a piece of music. Know that this is when you're reading it, you read it on that mixed vowel. For what purpose? To get the piece registered and to get it in tune.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, the rest is kind of easy. I have some other issues about how we use consonants and confuse it with rhythm. Consonants are not rhythm. Consonants are musical line. They carry sound. And for some reason, choral directors have been taught that if you want better rhythm, you need to double down on the consonants, and that's a bunch of nonsense too, because then you lose legato. And when you do that, the tongue starts reacting, because when you're pressurizing consonants and going, you throw the tongue out of its resonating position.
Mm-hmm.
I think I said this in the workshop, but I'm at Westminster Choir College, and about 8 years ago, I'm thinking, you're studying with some of the great teachers of the world, and what do they teach for a lot of money? Legato. And what do we do as choral directors? We do not live in a legato world, yet every piece calls for it. For some reason, we think the consonant is the rhythm. Donald, I've had the fortunate collegiality to have Donald Nally teaching with me the last 2 years, and I've learned a lot from Donald. We're of the same mind in many ways. But one of the things he pointed out in the choirs I conduct is when he would work with them, he said, "You need more rhythm." And that's all he would say. He wouldn't change his gesture. He wouldn't come out of legato. He said, "You just need more rhythm." Rhythm is the responsibility of the singers. It is not your responsibility, because the minute you start putting a pulse in your hand, other than an indication of where the beat is, if you start putting weight in, then this whole idea of vocal resonance gets screwed up. Instrumentalists won't have this problem. Singers do.
Yeah.
So for me, it's about e- everything on this recording. If you really listen, the amount of legato, depending upon the style, is astonishing, and I'm very proud of it. And the best choirs do this. But again, you can hear in choirs when they use the consonants for the rhythm, and then that screws up what I call, Chris, in both these books that are out, the inner architecture of the vowel. You have to be worried about what that inner architecture is to set up the resonances in anybody's resonantial head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would. Yeah, those are all really good points, and I'm interested to kind of take it into another aspect of your two presentations that you gave, and one that I was really, really excited about was the vocal pedagogical side of this conversation. The content on the Choralosophy podcast is free. One of the ways that I make that happen is by asking for your help. If you can support the show on Patreon or on Substack, I appreciate it, and it really does make this whole thing work. Because I do think that for a lot of music educators, especially, again, kind of thinking about the ones who don't get to work with some of the best singers in the world at Westminster, like you do, who are in the trenches, which is a term that I hate, but it is it is something that we deal with where we are teaching kids not only to read music sometimes for the first time, but also to just learn how to sing in general. And where a lot of music educators don't see the connection between those two things. So for a singer to learn to read music, not only they really also have to learn how to sing. You can't do one without the other, because the example I always give is that if a young adolescent female voice who oftentimes has breathiness issues in the mid voice that come from registration changes that they've never learned how to negotiate or feel, if they're reading in the key of F major, for example, they might see something that goes F to C on the page, and they will almost inevitably, as young singers, they'll sing F to A first, because they just don't know how much energy it takes to get to the C, and then they have to negotiate that registration. And some teachers the instinct would be to fix the note, as you said. And I think the important thing is to fix it in context of a line of music, and also to talk about the way that the voice works. So in almost all cases, when I have kids that will read F to A when they're supposed to sing F to C, I don't even talk to them about the note being wrong. I just talk to them about their registration and their breath, and then almost instantly they will fix it because they felt what it means. So when you were tying where to put the tongue, how to use the breath, how to sing with legato, all those types of things, to the concept of even just being able to read music and perform music in a rehearsal, etc. I think for a lot of people that's the missing link. Is we talk about notes and rhythms almost as if we're playing piano, and all we need to do is know what button to push at what time. But of course, for singers, it's vastly more complicated. Thoughts about that?
Well, I would say also, so I'm looking on my bookshelf in my study here, Chris. Years ago, I wrote a book of beginning patterns. It's called Listen. And it's tonic and dominant patterns, which I think every choir director should use in their rehearsals in a warm up. Basically, this takes singers. The issue is they have to hear not F to A, but F to A to C to F to C to A to F.
Uh-huh.
See, they have to hear the whole thing as a harmonic unit. So what I did was I took my opinion about Gordon pattern training and put that into a step-by-step book that only deals with tonic and dominant in choirs. Our first year choir at Westminster used them this year. Marion Jacob, who is one of my students who conducts that choir, used it. And starting with that ground zero, from there you make an inference. Gordon's principle was, look, I know it doesn't sound hot to do tonic and dominant. It's not very exciting. But think of this. If you know where tonic and dominant is, do, mi, sol, and then so, ti, re, and maybe a seventh fa, if you know where all those syllables are, you can then inference where all the other harmonies are if you know where tonic and dominant. So drilling down on tonic and dominant has long-term effects for literacy, for intonation. And so I would encourage people to look at this Listen book. It's the teacher's edition. There's always a teacher's edition, a student edition. The teacher's edition is an is idiot proof. And by that I mean a person who doesn't know learning theory and may screw up the steps. I have the steps all laid out. Do this first, then do this second.
Mm-hmm.
And the process is important. It seems, I sound like Ed Gordon, it seems like it's not potent. It's very potent. I did it with my high school choir many years ago when I was first learning theory, and their musicianship went through the ceiling because I didn't realize how much what inferences they could make. The other thing, Chris, I think that is lost in the profession. I think after grade 9, every choral person should give their students the advanced measures of music audiation test of Ed Gordon's, the AMMA.
Okay.
This will give you a tonal score and a rhythm score on a percentile rank. And basically, anybody above 40 percentile, there's people home. People who get 50%, there are more people home. If they get 60%, there are more people home. And I'm telling you, you got kids that are 70, 80, or God forbid, 90. there are kids in your choir that have better ears than you. You get a tonal score and you get a rhythm score. So you know right away, okay, for example, one year in Williamson Voices, I gave this when I first started that choir at Westminster, and I gave AMMA. The soprano average score was 98. That's unheard of tonally.
Mm-hmm.
Unheard of. Their composite rhythm score was 10. That year, Chris, dotted quarter and an eighth was a major task. And when they hit a rhythm problem, it manifested itself as a pitch problem. So for me, AMMA and those test results, not to keep any student out of a select ensemble or not sing. It's the old adage, Chris, that people with talent they become successful directly related to the amount of work they want to put into this.
Yeah.
I've had people who've scored 95 tonal and 92 rhythm. By the way, they're never equal in a human being. Tonal and rhythm, one's
Mm.
higher than the other. And they were lazy and they could have gone to Juilliard, but they were lazy. And then I've had students who have got 40s and went to the Eastman School
Yeah.
and are really incredible singers. So part of it is knowing how music aptitude plays in this. And I also think pattern training. So what the intonational solfège uh, book does is it goes one step beyond tonic and dominant, and it looks at modes and then has beautifully composed melodies in each mode that should be used as a vocalese with these incredible accompaniments. That it's the harmonic context that teaches people how to sing in tune. They listen to what's around them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's the value of the intonational solfège book. And again, I say in all the exercises, what's the dominant you should be playing to make sure this is in tune? And it's ear training. It's an ear training book, for God's sake, for a choral ensemble.
Yeah.
And the front of the book has all of the stuff about, for example, when you're singing with the piano, do I didn't know this. I hate to tell you, but for the choir to sing in tune, they have to sing sharp to the piano.
Perceptually, yeah. Mm-hmm.
No,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
must sing higher than the piano, because if they're with the piano, they will sound flat because of the temperament of the piano. Or
Right. Yes.
like when you're with string players, and when I do recordings with string players, I have to teach my choir that as soon on the attack of the pitch, they have to sharp it about 2 cents, because that's what string players do. And if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, the choir will sound flat. I mean, a C major, which we all hate. You can't tune C major. Well, you can tune C major if the sixth degree, every time you sing law in C major, if you don't sharp it at least 7 cents, which is a big sharp,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't tune. You get the sixth degree in tune, C major pulls in tune, and you can sing anything.
Yeah.
So the first part of the book has all of these tricks, or this science about intonation. What are the volatile scale degrees that you have to start getting into your singers? But back to your original point, tonic and dominant are the door in. And again, I would say this listen book is worth its weight in gold. It seems like boring. It is. It just sets up the parameters for tonality. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, this is actually interesting because it might be a good doorway into the one aspect. I mentioned this in an email. There was one part of your presentation I did not agree with, and that is related to the utility of solfège. And kind of, so my criticism was essentially sitting there listening. It's like, again, if I'm working with the singers of Westminster Choir who have years and years and years of learning how to read music prior to that, they could pick up a piece of music and read it on a mixed vowel. Well, my beginning ninth graders need a system. Like they need some frame of reference for What does a note on the bottom space of this little symbol that I've never seen before, and how far how far apart is that next note up? And some kids are truly coming to it with no frame of reference at all. In which case, the solfège then becomes a really good door for them to memorize do re mi fa so or do mi so or whatever. And so for them, it is a literacy tool. But again, with my upperclassmen, they've already learned to look at the music, use the solfège as a way to hear it in their head, and then they can sing it on neutral syllables. So I guess that would be. But I'm interested in hearing your response to that of solfège's value not just as an intonation tool, but also as a literacy tool for beginners. Thoughts? Don't forget to use the Choralosophy checkout code at all of the affiliates for the Choralosophy podcast. Those are sightreadingfactory.com whenever you renew your membership for you and your students. New, coming up, you're going to hear more about this later in July, but 3-Minute Theory is now an affiliate, and you can save 15% by entering Choralosophy when you sign up at 3minutetheory.com.
Okay. So I would say that in the listen book, solfège is used as a literacy tool.
Okay.
Here's the here is the thing. In a choral ensemble, we get people of all ability levels, and most of the people do not read well. So what causes the problem for people not being able to find pitches? So in the system I've developed, and by the way, in the Evoking Sound Choral series, there's several editions called Solfège editions where I've written in solfège. The system is this. The what I would throw back at you, Chris, is if you're training you're doing patterns, then you're all in unison, and you're just teaching intervallic relationships within a tonic and dominant pattern. But it becomes more complex in a choir because the parts are written in such a way that sometimes they don't lay within a triadic position, and that's where the sight reading falls apart. Here is the thing I came up with, and I will say around 2000, and let me explain how this happened. So there's a piece called The Lamb by John Tavener. I don't know if
Oh, yeah.
Little lamb, everybody's in unison. Then the altos come in, okay. It was from hell. The freshman choir, I would teach the soprano part, I would teach the alto part, I put them together, and it would never work.
Uh-huh.
I drilled it, I tested it. It would never tune. And one day, I'm at lunch with my graduate assistant, Matt Mahaffey, and Matt said, this learning theory thing, maybe what we need to do is call it what it is. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, this, and I forget the key signatures, but I think I'm close. I think the key signature is 1 sharp. The sopranos are singing in G, but the altos are singing in, I think, E flat.
That sounds right to me.
It's a mirror.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, why don't we just have the altos sing solfège in E flat and sopranos sing in G, because then we're just finding intervals based upon what they know, which is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do. No chromatic syllables. Well, damn, Chris, if they didn't nail that sucker right on the money.
Yep.
So the intonational system, the literacy system, oral literacy system, when I use solfège in a choir, it's intonational in that I am assigning, if the tenor part, I don't care what the key signature, if the key signature is 2 flats and the tenors have C sharps and only C sharps and naturalized Bs, the tenors are D is do. And for them to find their pitches, the way this system works, everybody has to solfège at the same time in their different major areas. So they're finding intervals. So I've taught pieces as difficult as the Rachmaninoff bells with this system, and they learn it immediately. So that in this context, the solfège system just helps them locate the interval in context.
Right.
One can argue that there's some literacy going on, but I'm not going to go down that road.
Yeah. So and partly that is Well, here's how I would say that our roles in the music education continuum are different in that sense. So, what the way you described it, it sounds exactly how I use solfège with high school kids. I just maybe it's a terminology thing. I think of that as for beginners, they're using it intonationally, but they're also using it as a way to read the music for the first time. Because and maybe this would be valuable context. People who listen to my show regularly already know this, but I rehearse entirely a cappella when we're learning music. So I don't play notes for kids ever.
Right.
And so with that kind of thinking about music like a language, which I know Ed Gordon did not believe music was a language explicitly, but in a lot of ways, what I'm teaching kids to do is learn how to sound out things for the first time. And so the description you just gave of like moving different people's dough around depending on the context of the music, that's exactly what I do. So I think maybe we're even more on the same page than I thought from that comment.
Yeah. And one of the things I think that people misunderstand, the context begins with the context, meaning my students are not, grad students are not allowed to read a piece until the choir hears the first 8 measures played.
Okay.
Because, Chris, you might as well be taking a lottery ticket. If you don't give that it's major, minor, is the piece in a mode? What is it? What's the sound of this composer? What does, you know, if they don't hear what the sound world is, then they're going to make note mistakes on the first reading that have nothing to do with the notes. They don't know the harmonic context. So one of the things, let me jump off here and pull this off the shelf for you. One of the things that is really important, if I can find this right away. Of course, there's so much up here. Okay. Um, there, so Ed used to do this thing, Chris, when he was doing patterns. And he would do this thing where he would go do 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 do. That sets the mode. Ba 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 ba. Well, first of all, I have a problem now, and I know it's passed, but I would try to, if he was alive, I would try to change him. Instead of going bum bum, I would go d d. I would use a mixed vowel on all patterns
Uh-huh.
because
Yeah.
right away you're teaching the vocal technique necessary to sing in tune. And here's the other mistake on patterns that people make: separate the notes. When you're having intonational problems, is it the fact that they don't know where the note is, or the fact that they're glissandoing between the pitches? Rehearse staccato. I mean, it's old
Oh yeah.
fashioned, but what I did was years ago, and these I forget how valuable they are. I took all of Ed's dee, 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 and harmonized them in this book.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so let's say you're going to do a piece in Mixolydian. There is a unison exercise. The choir sings in unison, but it's harmonized in Mixolydian. And I got to tell you, if you do this, you read a piece in Mixolydian, it will sing in tune immediately. For example, on the Serenity of Soul recording, one of the tracks I think that everybody has been amazed about is we do the Bruckner Os Justi. The problem with the Bruckner Os Justi is it's in Phrygian mode.
Mm-hmm.
Before they sang, they just sang one of these Phrygian exercises. That piece tuned like nobody's business from the first day.
Yeah.
If Look, what is the default in your singers? Major, and maybe in some of your kids who listen to a lot of um, contemporary music, or whoever they're listening to, they may have a warm relationship with Mixolydian, but every mode is foreign. So if you're doing something to set before they start reading, Chris, whether it's just playing the first 4 bars or doing these intonational, these I call them immersion exercises.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're ear training immersion. And the chapel choir Westminster this year used those also. And what it does is it just gives them tonal anchors. So you have to believe that the reason people can't sing a major third is because they're aurally confused where the resting tone and where the dominant is in the mode. Choirs default to major, Chris. The danger for all teachers is to understand that in this country, choirs default to major.
Yeah.
And if you're going to read something in minor, they don't hear law as the resting tone. They just go for some innate reason, and then minor never sings. Also, the modes have a difficulty. Here's something people don't understand. Ed did research through the AMMA test on the difficulty of modes, and he didn't determine them by his own thing. He looked at data, because I was his graduate student, on the AMMA test, which were the more difficult items. So in order, these are the difficulty of the modes, from easiest to difficult. Major is easiest, harmonic minor is next easiest, mixolydian is next, Dorian is next, Lydian is next, Phrygian is next, Aeolian mode pure is next, and surprise, surprise, melodic minor is one of the most difficult modes to sing in.
Yeah.
And then we have
Wow.
Locrian and octatonic. So this book is also arranged in order of difficulty of modes, just because if you have a good choir, any choir can sing any mode as long as you know how to prepare it.
Yeah.
So that's what's important. Yeah.
Yep. That's interesting because I didn't know that bit of research, but it aligns with my experience with kids because so typically you can guarantee within a school year in my classroom that my kids will be able to tell you and also sing for you major, minor, Dorian, and Mixolydian. Those are the ones that we're going to access now. Sometimes we'll access other ones depending on repertoire choices that we might have discovered. But I only see
Sure.
kids for 45 minutes a day, so there's only so much we can do. And those tend to be the ones that that they're able to access the quickest. And so it's really interesting. And what I'm hoping we can do kind of before we, maybe as a way to wrap up this really fascinating conversation, which I could do all day, is let's try to kind of focus people on the way out on what sounds to me like the core underlying thing here, which is that just choirs aren't being taught in many situations to listen. Like, what does it mean to listen? And what are the ways that we teach our choirs to listen? I know that in my personal experience, this is with beginners, this is why I rehearse a cappella, because it forces that listening to happen a little bit differently than when there's this noisy, very, very clear overtone spectrum instrument like a piano that tells them the right answer so quickly, or what they perceive to be the right answer, that in a lot of ways it turns off their listening because they feel like the note's already been played, and whether I sing or not doesn't matter because somebody's playing the notes correctly over here on the piano. So I learned that the hard way by doing that over the course of time. But what I'm interested in hearing your final thoughts on is that where do you think this lack of listening comes from in our profession, and how do we communicate it without making people mad because we're saying they're doing it wrong?
I would say, Chris, this is probably the biggest takeaway of the whole chat. Listening begins when you breathe.
Yeah.
This is the human moment. When I take a breath, you hear the breath, that's when listening begins. It can't begin once the first sound is started.
Yes.
And that's the key. And I got to tell you, the other thing I would say to people, if you said to me, what's one thing, as no matter what the level you're teaching at, what should you investigate? This changed my life. Having at the end of the warm up, my choir is literate in square note notation, and they learn their musicianship.
Sorry to interrupt. Since for the people listening and not watching, James just held up a book called Discovering Chant. Mm-hmm.
This book, it it gives you a teaching process where you learn by rote, and it's all in unison. But it's remarkable that because people have to listen to each other, it's the best way to do this. And by the way, there's another book coming out that's a, a partner to discovering chant, and it's going to be discovering improvisation through chant. And in that book, I use some of Alice Parker's lists of American folk songs that can function the same way as a Gregorian chant. You don't have to do Gregorian chant. You can do
Hmm.
folk song in unison. And and for example, on the CD, there's Shenandoah by James Erb. Listen to the intonation. Listen, that was all dominant encouraged, can I just
Hmm.
say?
Hmm.
But I would say, Chris, your question is very good. You listening and connection begins at the moment you breathe. And I again, I wrote a book called The Musician's Breath, where it's a whole book on how important and what happens when you take that breath. So I think listening begins in the breath, and I think listening doesn't end until the last sound is done and the last sound is deposited in the silence after the last note.
Yeah.
Silence to silence. Great lesson from Arvo Pärt's music that I learned. It's
Yeah.
about the silences. Yeah.
And for music educators in my position, or even ones with younger kids, I think the class, and this is not necessarily a topic for us to dive into. I'm just going to point this out that for a lot of music educators listening, if you don't work with adults, it's getting them to, like, you have to a classroom management technique to get them to just be quiet is crucial. I get criticized sometimes because I do have an expectation of like zero noise in my rehearsal space when we're trying to do music. My largest choir is 97 kids, and they are required to be quiet so
Yeah.
that we can start like you just described. It's can we start to all audiate? Can we hear the music we're about to try to sing as I breathe? Right. And then the other thing I'll point out too, and I want to know what you think about this. I think part of the conductor's role in this listening aspect is that they have to see us listen. And I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
No.
they look at us and they see us reacting to noises around the room, and in a lot of ways that teaches them to also be listening to the noises around in the room. And so it's a learned behavior. Thoughts about that?
They have to sense that you're listening, not see that you're listening.
There you go. Okay.
There's a semantic twist here.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm working with my conductors, I just know there's something about them, their being, that they're not listening. It's the same thing in life. Chris, you have a conversation with somebody and they're not listening to you. And it's maddening.
Yeah.
Where and I have no patience. Unfortunately, I have no patience for people who don't listen and people who don't understand that, you know, all of us deserve to be heard. And I think also I would say that this is a product of the pandemic. And I think it's a product of the world we live in because there's so much damn noise going on that people don't listen because they don't want to hear anything. I mean, it's just horrible. And so in your rehearsal room, somehow you have to redefine what it is to listen to one another and to value listening. And that's probably the strongest skill you give your singers as they exit your room. I mean,
Absolutely.
and the problem is the time we live in. There's so much nonsense going on. I'm tired of hearing it. But hearing that and listening to the breath in a room, and also, Chris, you hit on the other thing is I don't think it's easy for people to be still.
Yeah.
And
Oh, for sure.
I learned this in recording sessions. And I kick myself every recording session because my producer will come on and say, "Can we have some quiet or stillness before we start?" Because immediately I'm going. And there is this magical moment when you begin to listen and the room becomes very still. There's a whole thing called slow art in the art world that I've kind of plugged into too. In the Musician's Being book, I talk about slow art and slowing yourself down so you can listen. I think part of this, Chris, is that all of us, you, me, we move so fast, we're not calm enough to hear a damn thing.
Yeah.
The internal energy. And so this idea of slowing oneself down so you really can hear, because music is complicated. It's more complicated than language, because in addition to the notes and the rhythms, you have what the music is telling you or trying to tell you. And that requires the big human being with the big ears, you
Yeah.
know?
That is so profound and exactly right. And I really appreciate that framing. Um, Man, Professor Jordan, this is really, really good stuff. Before we sign off, tell us, we've been talking about a lot of books that you've written over the years, and I think most people know that you've got a lot of those out there and recordings and et cetera. What is the best place for people to find them? Is there
Ah,
is there kind of a one-stop shop?
well, here's the problem. So the problem with all the respect to GIA, if you don't know the exact, so if if you don't know the exact title of the book on the GIA website, you won't find them. And I have 65 of them.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So what's happening, and it will be up probably by the end of the summer, is on the choralacademy.com. There will be a either call a bookstore or library. And when you come up, there'll be a bookshelf that comes up that says pedagogy. And on it, Chris, you will see the covers of every book.
Oh, that's amazing.
And if you click on it, it flips. It tells you about the book, and another click, you can order it immediately. The problem is there's so much. There's so much material. I mean, really, it's now book 67, if I'm accurate. And the books that I wrote, like this listen book I told you about, and the ear training immersion exercises for choir book that I
Uh-huh.
mentioned in the modes, those are written, 10, 15 years ago. And if you don't know ear training immersion, you will never find that book. If you put in ear training, you get other people's books, and that's the problem. So I would ask all the listeners to go and just go the choralacademy.com right now. It's sign up for the mailing list. That's all it is. And then you'll be notified when I'm going all around the country teaching courses. Going to people. There's going to be weekends with me where I'm just going to drill down on one thing, like law bond for conducting or whatever.
Right.
And so and there'll be a certification that goes along with this for people who want the paper. It's credit and non-credit, but mostly that we will issue certificates for all the courses.
Yeah.
But again, it's just a way of getting this material out. So the book question is a good one and very timely. So on the choralacademy.com, there will be this bookshelf area where the books will be organized by, learning theory, pedagogy, vocal technique, etc. Yeah.
That sounds great. So what I'll do then is I'll put a link to the Choral Academy in the show notes to this episode, and then when you feel like it's kind of ready to go, just let me know and I'll
I will.
blast that out to people,
I
because
will.
I think these are really, really important things. Well, James, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope we can do it again someday.
Oh yeah, please. And again, thanks for being so patient and waiting for me. But I did want to do this, and I loved my visit to Missouri. I got to tell you, it was a great time.
Yeah, it's a good place to be. I like it here.
Yep, absolutely.
All right.
Except, can I say Margaritaville? I'm still not. I'm not.
Isn't that weird?
I'm not sure what that's about.
It,
Anyway.
when they switched names of that place, that was 5 or 6 years ago, that led to some very awkward conversations when I had to write parents of high school kids that were taking kids to Margaritaville next week for all-state choir, and
Understood.
it it led to some very interesting conversations. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. If you are still listening, that means you're one of the people who are MVPs of the Choralosophy podcast, the people who stick around to the end. Of course, the ways to help are to use the Choralosophy promo code at sightreadingfactory.com, mymusicfolders.com, 3minutetheory.com, EndeavorMusicPublishing.com, GraphitePublishing.com, and of course you can join the Patreon. Link is in the show notes. You can also subscribe at Substack and chip in a few dollars a month there. All of those things are great ways to help, and of course like, share, leave comments, be part of the conversation. That's what this is all about. See you guys next time.